Good morning, brothers and sisters. Hello, welcome to another video with me, Matthew Gill, Prophet and First Elder of the Restored Branch of Jesus Christ, and Happy New Year. It's our first lesson of the new year. We've already had a church sermon, so welcome. I hope that you enjoyed your Christmas. I hope that you had a wonderful time with your family and friends, and you're able to see everybody you wanted to see. And welcome to the final Joseph Smith video. It has been a long time coming, I am aware, but we are here at last. We're going to be discussing the Nauvoo period and comparing it to the Kirtland period, and we're going to also discuss Joseph's martyrdom and what my thoughts about that are, especially with the new documentary that's dropped in America, Who Killed Joseph, I think it's what it's called, which I would love to see, but I'm not able to because I'm not an American, so I can't go to the cinema to see it, so I'll have to wait. But I have my notes and we're all ready to rock and roll. So Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo period is an interesting period with regards to Joseph Smith and the church. What we have to remember, and a good friend of mine likened it to this, there are 7 years in Kirtland, 7 years in Nauvoo, which I thought is interesting when he pointed it out, and how you could compare that to the dream of Joseph in Egypt, the 7 good years and the 7 lean years, especially when you consider that 46 revelations were received in Kirtland, and just a handful received in Nauvoo, maybe even just 3. I mean, I know if you're LDS, they include the revelations such as March 1st, 1841, 126, 129, 130, 31, 32. Well, 132 is the Polygamy Rev, which we know Joseph didn't give. 135 is not a revelation anyway, and then there's the 131 revelation on marriage, which isn't Joseph, and then of course Joseph gives an 1843 short revelation announcing that the Father had a body of flesh, which contradicts the lectures on faith, which is why I don't think he did that either. And then there's the 129, which is February 9th, 1843. Short revelation dealing with angels and resurrected body. So I don't believe that is necessarily true either. And then of course you've got the July 9th 126, which is a message to Brigham Young. And then of course you've got the March 1st 1841 revelation about the city of Zarahemla on the opposite side of the city of Nauvoo. I'm not saying that Zarahemla isn't opposite the city of Nauvoo. I believe it is. Whether that would be classed as a revelation, according to the reorganisation, only 3 revelations are received in Nauvoo, whereas the Kirtland period has 46. So you do the math. I mean, it's pretty simple, really. And then, of course, the LDS Church have got 124, 127, and 128. So 1841, 1842, 1842. So there's really nothing really after 1842 that I would consider to be a revelation. And it is a very lean year for revelation. I'm sorry, a very lean period for revelation, especially when you compare it to the Kirtland period. And I think the whole church was different anyway. It went from being a very spiritual, open, manifested church to a very closed community in Nauvoo. And we have to remember also that Joseph during the Nauvoo period was hardly ever there anyway, but he involved himself in things that were very unusual for Joseph to involve himself in, especially after the collapse of Kirtland. For instance, he was mayor, and he was head of the Nauvoo Legion, and he got involved in enterprises that really he shouldn't have got involved in. Let's not forget, this is the same man who had a revelation from God telling him that he wouldn't be any good at temporal affairs, getting involved in temporal affairs. I would conclude from the Nauvoo period that Joseph was out of touch with his office of prophet, much more so than in Kirtland. And when you consider he died in 1844 in June, and the stuff he left unfinished and undone, and of course you've got the problems that were around at Nauvoo that probably weren't manifesting very greatly at Kirtland, such as the polygamy issue. Now let me make this perfectly clear from the outset. I do not believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I don't believe Emma was. I don't believe Hiram was. I certainly don't believe it was a church policy. However, I do believe there were people who were involved in the church who were practicing polygamy and conducting polygamous services and rituals whilst Joseph was a prophet. And you could argue, well, he was the prophet, he was the head of the church, the buck stops with him, why didn't he do anything about it? Well, if you read the Price books, Joseph Smith Fought Polygamy, and you read the exoneration of Emma, Joseph and Hiram, and you read A Faithful Retelling, Joseph Smith Revealed, which are all about polygamy. You look at other content, but those books, especially the three Price books, definitely worth a read, and of course the Exoneration and A Faithful Retelling. You've got to read these books, and I think polygamy is very much one of those things where you either believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist or you don't, and never the twain shall meet. You're never going to get a polygamist to agree that Joseph wasn't one. You're never going to get a person who believes Joseph wasn't a polygamist to agree that he was one. It's one of those arguments that's very much based on opinion. There's very little historic proof or fact, regardless of what people say who support the polygamy argument. I mean, one of the biggest arguments I have with the polygamy issue is Joseph Smith was prolific in making children with Emma, because a lot of them died. But even so, he had children with Emma. There's no evidence he had children with any of his polygamous wives. And if we're talking, and the way Joseph Smith is described as a polygamist, he would certainly have had sexual relations with the women he should have married. Why were there no children out of any of those marriages? This doesn't make any sense to me. And especially the way they build up the polygamy issue is that Joseph Smith was a lecherous, dirty old man, or dirty young man, depending on how you want to look at it. He would definitely have been having sexual relationships with these women or these girls, depending on how young you want to take the argument. And that's the other problem, isn't it? Because as soon as you start attacking Joseph Smith on the polygamy ground, you have to attack his office completely, because then you have to say he was an unfit person to walk the earth, period, because he was marrying girls, children. And then, of course, that brings into play the paedophilia argument, and why would God choose somebody? I mean, the whole thing unravels when you start delving into that, and I can see why it would unravel, which is why I don't believe it ever took place. I believe polygamy was taking place. I certainly believe Brigham Young was a polygamist, John Taylor, Willard Richards, Wilford Woodruff, many of the leading members of the Travelling 12 were almost definitely polygamists. And I believe that they were conducting secret ceremonies and meetings running alongside the official church. And Joseph was aware of those things. If you read the Price books, he was aware of those things. And there's documentation saying that he was going to bring Brigham Young to a church court. And he was going to bring Willard Richards and John Taylor to church court. And he was going to have it out with them. And he was going to solve the problem. And anyone that says, well, he had like 40 odd wives and it was marrying children. Well, if you want to believe that, that's fine, but you've got to base it on fact. And I'm sorry, there is not enough evidence for me, apart from anecdotal, and people who support Brigham Young telling us he did these things, that he was ever a polygamist. So the Nauvoo period was full of all kinds of things that the Kirtland period wasn't. Firstly, I don't think it had the spiritual aspect that the Kirtland period had. The Kirtland period was there were manifestations of spirituality all over the place. Angels, talking to God, all kinds of things. And if you compare that to the Kirtland period, there was virtually none of that. And Joseph was on the run all the while. He was hardly ever there. They started to build a temple in Nauvoo, which the finished article looked nothing like the plans Joseph Smith had. I mean, there are plans available for you to look at that Joseph Smith had for the temple, but it was virtually incomplete by the time he died. I mean, everyone keeps going on about how the temple was a working temple, but it wasn't. It wasn't a working temple. It was far from it. The basement was finished, and the main hall was finished. If you look at the plans for Joseph's plans for the Nauvoo temple, they're nothing like today. You can't go into the Nauvoo temple today unless you hold a temple recommend from the LDS Church. And they go on about, the outside is exactly as Joseph wished it, but the inside's a working temple. You mean basically the whole thing isn't anything like Joseph envisaged. And if you look at the original plans for the Nauvoo temple, there's nowhere for LDS type ceremonies to take place. There's certainly not a grand meeting hall there. There's certainly not a ballroom there. So I think the problem is, because the LDS Church is so all-encompassing and large, we tend to take their cue on history and run with it as fact, and it's really not. So if you look at Kirtland, they were at Kirtland from 1831 to 1837, and they were in Nauvoo from 1839 to 1846. 7 years and 7 years. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. It's an exceptional way of looking at it, and I have to thank my friend James McKay in the US for pointing that out to me, because it's an interesting way of looking at the whole thing, and could make a really good study if you wanted to go and do that. So with Joseph involving himself in politics, armed force, militia type stuff, being a mayor, trying to run businesses, I don't think it was a very successful period. It might have been a more stable period, but I really would question that either. It might have been a more stable period as far as the church is concerned, but you'd have to look at both Kirtland and Nauvoo and compare the two. And I'm not convinced Nauvoo is any more stable or unstable. I just think it was a very tumultuous period with regards to Joseph Smith's mental state. He certainly didn't have a handle on who was coming or going. He certainly made bad decisions with regards to people he put into positions of authority. He wasn't quick enough to deal with the problems at hand. But I think he was hamstrung by the fact that he was always on the run or trying to evade arrest. Then coming home to his family, trying to be a father and a husband. And if you throw polygamy on top of that, the guy would never have had any time to do anything. So, that's why I just don't think he was ever involved in that at all. And then we come to probably the most important part of the Nauvoo era, which is, of course, the martyrdom itself, which, again, is one of those subjects that you could talk about forever. And they've made a documentary on it and tried to solve forensically who killed Joseph and Hiram in Nauvoo, because no one really knows. The LDS Church have changed tack again recently about how Joseph and Hiram died in in Carthage. So that they're not even sticking anymore to the two eyewitness accounts, which were from Willard Richards and John Taylor. That they're changing tack, and I think that when the evidence is looked at forensically, and you compare it to the eyewitness accounts, they just don't work. They don't work. I mean, I have my personal opinions on how Joseph and Hiram died, and I certainly think that Willard Richards and John Taylor were accomplices in their deaths. Don't forget, they didn't need to be there. They weren't prisoners. They were there out of their own free will and volition. And I sometimes wonder whether they weren't there to keep Joseph and Hiram there. Is it possible that Joseph and Hiram could have walked out of Carthage any time they wanted to? I mean, there's an argument for that, maybe. Were they being kept there? Probably. John Taylor certainly wasn't injured in the way in which he reports he was injured. Just look at the watch. The watch doesn't make any sense. There was a clock shot in Carthage that was ripped to pieces by the same shot that went through a watch, apparently. It doesn't make any sense. The wounds on Hiram's body certainly don't make any sense from where they say the shots came from. There were definitely shots from behind Joseph whilst they're at the top of the stairs. Well, they couldn't have been from outside. They must have been from inside the prison. So, my personal view on that whole martyrdom issue, and I haven't seen the documentary, so I don't know what findings they've come to, but I certainly believe that John Taylor and Willard Richards played a part in the death of the prophet and his brother, who, let's not forget, would have been prophet had Joseph died. He would have took the reins of the church. And it's convenient that not long after Joseph and Hiram die, Samuel also dies in mysterious circumstances. So all the big three brothers are now out of the way. You're not going to leave the church to William because he's incapable of leading anything. The big three hitters are gone. First two are taken out in Carthage, and the last one's taken out in mysterious circumstances. So I don't buy the story that it was just a mob incident. I think there were people inside the mob who knew Joseph personally, who were probably members of the church, and I think they had coordination with people inside the jail, and I'm talking about Willard Richards and John Taylor. I certainly think the mob knew they were there. I certainly think, I think it's interesting how Willard Richards comes out of that situation without a scratch on him. When there are shots flying through the door, and he's supposed to be behind the door. We know there are shots flying through the door because you can see where the balls went through, because they weren't bullets, they were balls, musket balls. And you can see where some of the shots were fired in that prison. And how he came out with no scratches on him, and how John Taylor miraculously gets shot, but his watch saves him, and he rolls under the bed. And okay, he was injured, but I don't think he was injured on purpose. And I certainly think the shots from behind Joseph and Hiram at the top of the stairs just lead me to believe that John Taylor or Richard had access to a pistol. We know Joseph had a pistol in the prison. He had a 6-shooter pepper pot gun given to him by Whitlock. So he was armed. Hiram was armed. I think he had a 1-shot gun pistol. We know Joseph fired into the mob coming up the stairs. We know that. We know that Joseph wasn't in that prison just ready to die. He was willing to fight for his life. And I just think events just overtook both of them. I believe Joseph fell out the window. But I believe he was alive when he hit the ground. I think he was badly injured when he hit the ground, don't get me wrong. I think he was probably going to die anyway, but I think he was alive when he hit the ground. I certainly believe he pulled himself up, or was probably dragged to the well. Uh, there's more to the martyrdom than the story that you're being told, and the problem is now, it's like a cold case, isn't it? You get CSI onto it. Probably the CSI probably solved it in like 2 seconds, but this is real life, and it's a very cold case, and like deep freeze case. So who knows? Who knows? But you just have to follow the path of the evidence that you presented, and that's my opinion that John Taylor and Willard Richards had something to gain from Joseph and Hiram not making it out of that prison that day. There's just too much for them to go. And don't forget, John Taylor went on to be president of the LDS Church. Was caught up in all the problems with the polygamy issue. Lived some time of his life in Canada on the run. So, they all had something to go. I mean, Willard Richards was on the 12 leading council members of the LDS Church. They all had something to gain. Brigham Young had something to gain with Joseph not coming out of there. They all did, in my opinion. And I think polygamy was a driving force behind it. I certainly think there were members of the church, senior members of the church, involved in the murder of the prophet. Which is probably why God allowed it to fracture at the end, which comes to the very, very latter end of Nauvoo. I mean, Joseph Smith's now dead, and he died on 27th of June 1844. The bodies were brought home in a terrible state. His son witnessed his father's and his uncle's bodies being dressed. I mean, and the church was in turmoil, absolute turmoil. Who was going to lead us now? And we had candidates step up: James Strang, Sidney Rigdon. There were Emma Smith had her favourites. Brigham Young then stepped into the breach. What annoys me about the whole thing is we're presented through LDS history, aren't we? And they're the biggest church, aren't they? So their history and the way they present it is going to override most things. That he steps into the breach because no one else is capable, and he took all the saints west, which is just a lie. There were a number that went west. I'm not saying there weren't, but there were just as many that didn't go with him. They didn't go with Brigham. He either stayed in Nauvoo, went on later to found the Restoration or the Reorganization Church. There were those that went with James Strang. There were those that went the Forrest Cutler and Hendrick. I mean, it wasn't as cut and dry as they make it, and it certainly wasn't this thing where Joseph Smith appeared in the likeness, or Brigham Young appeared in the likeness of Joseph Smith, and everyone was enthralled by it, and they knew that he was a prophet. I mean, it's just nonsense. Brigham Young took advantage of a situation. He was an exceptional leader, an exceptional organizer, far better than Joseph, and a very buoyant character. I would not have wanted to get on his wrong side. And he took advantage and took a vast swathe of people west with him. And as soon as they got to winter quarters, he pronounced himself prophet, priest, and king. So, we have to look at the other claimants. Sidney Rigdon was just a viable candidate as anybody else, and he took his followers east to Pennsylvania, and eventually. His church founders, and it becomes William Bickerton's church, and then you get the Bickertonites, Church of Christ out there. But that was started by Sidney Rigdon, and then so you got that, and then you got the Strangites who went to Michigan, Beaver Island, and all that. So it wasn't as cut and dry as all. Everybody went with Brigham, and those that stayed founded the Reorganization. They were all over the place. The church was splintered, and Joseph received a vision before he died that's what would happen, and it happened. And I think that was a direct consequence of the way we treated the prophet and the way the church had been run in the last 7 years. So those are my views, whether you like them or not. The views that I have, and those are the views that we teach. I've got some questions here mostly about polygamy, as far as I can see. What are your thoughts on all the wives who said they were Joseph's lovers? Paulie, surely not all these women would lie. Sandy, is it possible in your opinion that he could have been a polygamist? Junior, do you believe that it was all Brigham Young issue and not a Joseph Smith issue? Lindy, all the evidence points to Brigham Young rather than Joseph Smith. I would agree with that. Don, if you look around all the restoration organisations, none of the reorganised branches or organisations believe in it. None of the other offshoots still hold to it, but the LDS still endorse it and still readily teach it. That's true. Which is another indicator, I suppose. And then Brian, is it not possible that the LDS still practice it today? I mean, those are all valid questions. Firstly, what do I think all the wives said? I think people lie. People get infatuated with people and would like to be his wife. I think that's another problem we have. And why wouldn't they lie? They've got something to gain, sort of a lot to lose. Is it possible that he could have been a polygamist? Well, it's possible. He could have been a man from Mars. Anything's possible. But I very much doubt it. Do you believe it? I believe it was a Brigham Young issue. I believe that he drove the polygamy argument and the underground polygamy movement. I certainly believe that. And you are right, Lindy. All the evidence does point to Brigham Young rather than to Joseph. Brigham Young never states publicly that he's not a polygamist, whereas Joseph Smith stated on several occasions that he was not a polygamist from the pulpit. And they released an official statement, Joseph and Hiram, in 1843, I think it was, that he wasn't a polygamist. We have to bear all those things in mind. Now, if you believe Joseph Smith is a false prophet and a liar, then it fits your argument perfectly, but I don't. Looking around the offshoots, I don't really like calling them offshoots because it means they all come from the LDS Church and they don't. So I don't like calling them offshoots. We're certainly not an offshoot. And the reorganisation isn't an offshoot. It's a separate organisation, and they've had their own problems, and they've been fractured and splintered themselves into independent branches. But none of them hold with the polygamy issue. Bickertonites don't endorse polygamy. The Strangites did for a while. They started not to, then did, then didn't. It hasn't really stuck with any of the other organisations. Only the LDS Church. And you could argue, as Brian makes the argument, that because of the temple service, because of the temple endowment, they still endorse polygamy. If anyone has been through an LDS temple service lately, because I haven't, I've been left the church for a long time, the LDS Church for a long time. The last temple or endowment session I went through was probably in very early 2000s. And I know it's changed a lot since, but I've seen them online because you can get anything online these days. I've seen a recent one online, and the theme running through it is that, yeah, I mean, basically you will have all the wives given to you in the next life. And anyone that wants to argue with me about that, I'm certainly available to talk and discuss it with you. Because LDS endowment ceremony is nothing short of an abomination in the sight of God. Even its new incarnation, it's an abomination. It teaches false doctrine. Certainly teaches polygamy in a spiritual sense. And I believe in my heart of hearts, if they could, they would practice polygamy openly. What you have to ask yourself is this: the LDS Church's scriptures all support polygamy. right? Historically, they've been polygamous, and they haven't changed their scriptures to reflect the fact that they're not polygamous, because section 132 on polygamy is still there. Section 131 on marriage is still there. It's not like they've taken it out and decided this isn't right. It's still in their codified scripture. Now, I don't believe that those revelations came through Joseph, but that's irrelevant. They're saying they are revelations, and they're still in their codified scripture. So they still believe those things then, don't they? Spiritually, if not physically in law, they still believe that it's fact that when you become a god, you will have more than one wife. So they're still supporting the spiritual argument of polygamy. They're just not openly practicing it. I think if they could get away with it, they would. They certainly are encouraging polygamous people to come back to church, especially now that they've said that polygamy is no longer a punishable offence. So anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. And I don't want to get sidetracked because we're talking about Joseph and Nauvoo. So Joseph and Nauvoo, tumultuous, lean, could be likened unto Joseph of Egypt. I think that's a very good argument. And we just have to look at the amount of revelations received. Very, very few. Very, very few. And even if you take into consideration the added ones by the LDS Church, it's still nowhere near the amount that they received in Kirtland. Nowhere near. I think the Lord drew back his hand. I mean, there was 46 revelations in Kirtland, 3 to 6 in Nauvoo. So you can see the pattern. And I don't think Joseph was in a good place. So I hope that gives you a taste of what we believe happened in Nauvoo and what we believe happened to Joseph in Carthage. That concludes my lesson for today. Just a bit of information. I am due to be recording a video with Gospel Tangents on Sunday. I'll let you know how that goes, and I don't know when it's going to be available with Gospel Tangents, if ever. I suppose it depends on how well the interview goes and the process. And then the following week I'm due on a UK based podcast, so that should be interesting. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, and I'll let you know how all those things go in the coming days and weeks ahead. So thank you for listening today. I hope you found it instructive and interesting. At least it might raise some questions and some discussion points. And we'll be back again with our recorded sermon with Elder Philip Gill. And we'll see you again soon. So take care, God bless, look after yourselves, and keep reading, keep studying, keep probing, keep asking the questions. That's the only way we're going to learn. And I'll see you again soon. God bless. Bye bye.